Hi everybody, we are going to talk about a first part of our lecture, trace evidence, hairs. Trace evidence is an important term because the purpose of something such as hair being considered a trace evidence category is that it's physical evidence that cannot alone link a suspect, but the origin of the evidence to a group of individuals could include the suspect. So, what is trace evidence good for? And specifically, what are hairs? Why is that good physical evidence? Well, it does help in identifying criminal suspects. It helps in identifying crime victims. It helps in the association process of a victim or suspect with a location. And then it also helps determine the type of crime that was possibly committed. We're going to get a little bit into the morphology and structure of hair. We'll do a couple of lab activities to sort of reinforce the ideas of hair as forensic evidence. But it is important to know firsthand that you cannot individualize hair to a single person by these things, the morphology or the structural characteristics. If we had what's called the follicular tag, and you may have heard that in one of our CSIs prior or through conversation, we can use some of those dead skin cells from the follicular tag to help potentially run DNA analysis for individualizing that hair to a source. So, what are a couple of important things? That you have to make sure that you've properly collected that hair sample at the crime scene, as well as potentially having the standard/reference sample. We've talked about that in several of our units as well. Most of the time we have that reference sample that we can cross-reference to the one that's in question. And then, what can that do? That can help us place that suspect potentially at that scene. So remember, like the reference sample would, for example, be that a hair sample is requested from you as a source. If you're a potential suspect, your hair sample becomes that reference sample to cross-compare against the question one at the crime scene. Again, we're going to talk about some things with hair evidence, and you're also going to see with human hair, there's a huge variation in hair samples from strand to strand. But there are also characteristics that can help us put it into categories. So hair is very unique. All right, so what's the significance of hair evidence? Well, it can be transferred during physical contact. So that's Locard's principle. The presence of it can associate a suspect to a victim or a suspect victim to a crime scene. The types of hair recovered, the condition those hair samples are in, and the number of hairs found are all valuable as evidence in a criminal investigation. And a couple of great examples of types of hair, because that's generally something I question you guys about when we're having lecture, is what do I mean by types of hair? Well, it could be hair from different locations of the body. The condition those hairs are in, a great example of that is, was the hair forcibly ripped? Can you see that obviously there was some type of struggle, or is this hair that just was already in the third stage of existence, and so therefore it was just easily transferred during that contact? And the number of hairs found is also extremely viable information, and sort of strengthens that as a source. Now, the comparison of the microscopic characteristics of those question hair samples to the known or standard hair samples is critical in helping determine whether a transfer between two individuals may have occurred. Okay, so we're going to look at the morphology and structure of hairs. So there are several parts to a strand of hair that are going to be unique to the type of animal species that we are examining. So we have the cortex, which is the main body. We have the medulla, which is the central area. That long singular black line here is what would be considered the medulla. And the medulla can vary among strand to strand. So just because you may have a continuous medulla, which we'll talk about what that means in a moment, doesn't necessarily mean that every hair strand on your head of hair actually has continuous medulla, and that's what makes hair tricky as evidence. And then, of course, we have the cuticle, which is the outer layer, and the purpose of that is to provide that long-term protection to the hair strand. And of course, this on the left is an example of a pencil. But oddly enough, there are continuous medulla within the hair shaft that resemble that. Okay, so hair grows from a follicle. Awesome. And we could talk a little bit more about some of the evolutionary processes of follicles and the purpose of how hair grows from that. But all things aside, hair grows from a follicle, and then we have what's called the root of the hair, and that is contained within that follicle, which is located within your scalp. So the shaft of the hair connects with the root, and the shaft has three parts, which we just discussed: the cuticle, the cortex, and the medulla. The shaft ends with a tip of the hair. So the ending of your hair, depending on how long that is what's considered the shaft end. All right, the cuticle is a very, very important part of hair. So this is what allows the hair to retain structural features and is resistant to chemical decomposition for long periods of time. There have been bodies that have been found preserved thousands of years, and the hair is still, because of the protection of the cuticle and the purpose of it, completely still intact. It is the outside layer of the hair. It's formed by these scales that layer themselves and overlap one another, and those scales always point towards the tip of the hair. So that's how they're growing, as they're growing towards the tip of the hair. And they're formed from keratinized, specialized cells that are located within the follicle. And what happens is they harden and flatten as that hair is formed. Now we are going to do, the very first thing that we're going to do as a lab activity is we're actually going to create a cast of hair samples. And we're going to do a variety of different animal species. We're going to do human, I think we have cat, dog, horse, I think we have some deer hair. And so we're going to really get an opportunity to see that among species of animals that the cuticle has its own unique shape or structure. And that's one way for identification purposes of unknown hair samples. Okay, so the cuticle, you can see here, these are two different animal species here, and each has its own unique cuticle structure. So we call these a scale pattern, and it's useful for species identification of hair samples. Animals other than human exhibit a variety of unique patterns. Again, this is not useful for individualizing human hair because simply each animal within that species would have that same type of cuticle pattern. Okay, so here are three of our general cuticle structures. There are some more subcategories and complex ones, but we'll just look at these three. Coronal, I think of these as like stacked cups. Okay, and you can see here that there are three subcategories for this coronal, that they're not all created equal. Then we have spinous, which also makes sense. You can see here that they look like little spines protruding out all around the cuticle. And then imbricate, which is a very common cuticle structure, which is also what humans have as a scale pattern. Okay, and the cortex. So this is the layer just underneath the cuticle. This is really the main component of the hair sample. It's composed of these spindle-shaped cells that run parallel to the hair, and this is where it also contains the pigment granules that give hair its color. So the distribution, the color, and shape of those granules help with comparing hair samples of individuals. And here's another example of cortex here, looking at this. Structural features examined by microscopic examination. We use refractive index to do that. We won't go into any further detail, but that's also something that we talked about whenever we did our glass unit. All right, and we'll pick up with the medulla here shortly, okay? Thank you.